I'd been working the night shift at Willowgate Cemetery in Kentucky for 15 years. I'd show up just before 11 every night, sign my name in the big logbook 10:47 p.m. Exactly. That night chat a bit with Darren, the day guy, about whatever burials had gone in, check the service calendar pinned by the clock, and then grab the key ring with the red tag. That tag's basically a passport for the whole property. If you've got it, you can get anywhere. Nights ran 11 to 7. The halls were quiet. No phone calls to juggle. No big family groups wandering in and out, and $2 extra an hour on top. For me, that was worth missing the sunlight. First order of business, always the same. Front gate locked. West maintenance yard, chain pulled tight. Utility shed, latch clicked. Then I do a slow walk through the office. More out of habit than need, checking the bathroom for paper and soap. Making sure the little charging cradle for the radios was glowing. Logbook opened to a fresh page with a pen clipped to the spine, so nobody could claim they couldn't find it. The corkboard had our map. You could tell everything you needed to know about the week just by glancing at it. Green pins for new burials. Blue for work orders. Yellow for headstones that needed straightening. And way up in the northwest corner, there's a faded oval drawn in pencil labeled Founders. That's where the oldest stones are. The perimeter loop around the place is just over 3 miles if you stick to the gravel service road and don't cut across. The golf cart lives on a charger by the back door, flashlight wedged under the seat, first aid kit tucked behind it, and the gate keys taped together so they won't rattle loose when you're bouncing over the road. Most shifts are calm. You get a few predictable disruptions. Kids daring each other to sneak in. Couples cutting across because the fence is the shortest route to where they're going. Someone who swears they lost something here, but obviously didn't. I treat everyone like they're just out of place. Not trouble, because 9 times out of 10, that's exactly the case. The 10th, that ends with a police report and a trespass warning neatly folded into the log. The night I'm talking about couldn't have started more normal. I even wrote the patrol times in the log's margin without thinking about it. First run at 11, 22nd at 12, 12, 3rd at 1:03. Nothing out of the ordinary. I sat at the desk, ate cold leftovers straight from the container, skimmed last week's notes about a leaning marker in Section D, and scribbled a reminder to call maintenance. At 2.01 on the nose, I clipped the radio to my belt and headed out for my 4th loop. Willowgate's layout is simple, long, rectangle, slight hill in the middle. At the far end, there's a line of scrubby trees and a fence marking the township border. That northwest corner is the one that draws the most random visitors, thanks to a roadside pull-off that looks like legit parking spot. I steered the cart that way without even thinking about it. The motor hummed steady as I climbed the slope, a sound I'd probably miss if it ever stopped. Then I saw something. At first, it was just a shape by the fence. I'm used to shapes. Your brain learns to ignore them until they do something worth paying attention to. This one didn't move, just stood there. I let the cart drift until I could make out a man on the other side of the fence, facing in. Hands at his sides, still as stone. The rule book says don't turn a small problem into a big one, so I didn't go straight for him. I kept rolling, curved along the loop, telling myself I'd circle back in about 30 seconds from a better angle. If he tried the fence, I'd catch him in the act. If he left, I'd log it and be done. When I came back, he was gone. That could have meant anything, and usually anything means nothing. Still, something about it nagged at me. I crossed the little service bridge, finished the loop, and decided to swing past the northwest line one more time before heading in. And there he was. Only now he was inside, standing dead center in the gravel road. Same posture as before. Upright, facing me, not moving. I stopped the cart, shut off the motor. He didn't budge. Mid-40s maybe. Regular jacket, work pants. No obvious weapon. No slouch. No sway. No glassy eyes, none of the tells I'd expect from someone drunk or high. "Sir," I said, voice calm and even. "The cemetery's closed. I need to walk you to the gate." No reaction. I've had vets freeze like that, locked up and staring. I've had teenagers pull the same thing, just to see what I'd do. My approach never changes. Give them a clear instruction. Avoid touching if I can. Make the exit sound like their idea. "You'll need to leave now," I said. "We can walk to the exit together." Still nothing. I stepped forward and gave his shoulder a light 2-finger tap. Not a shove, just enough to say I'm here. His head whipped toward me so fast my own flinch felt slow. We locked eyes close enough that it felt like a collision. His face tightened, like someone bracing for a fight, not avoiding one. I pulled my hand back and stepped aside. He turned, no words, walked to the fence and stepped over it in one smooth motion like he'd measured it in advance. Didn't look back, didn't run, just walked into the trees and disappeared. I wasn't following him into the county side at 2 in the morning. I went straight to the maintenance office, locked the steel door, and filled in the incident form 2:19 a.m., male subject, northwest corner. Left the notify law enforcement box unchecked for now. First question's always whether they're coming back. I was halfway through the location line when the door jolted. The metal flexed hard enough to shift the latch. Then it happened again. The hits were spaced out, deliberate. Each one pushed an inch of air into the room. I grabbed the radio and called dispatch. Willowgate Cemetery, maintenance office. Unknown male subject impacts on the door. Police requested. The pounding didn't stop. 3 solid minutes of it, like clockwork. I stayed to the hinge side best spot if the lock gave and shouted through the steel that officers were on the way. My name, my voice, no bluff. Then silence. I gave it 2 more minutes before asking dispatch for an ETA. I didn't move until headlight swept the lot in a pattern I recognized as patrol. Only then did I unbolt the lock. The officers came in. I gave the description, showed them where he'd crossed. No breaks in the wire, no snags. Soil's too poor for footprints. They walked the yard, the road, cleared the place. I logged their unit numbers, times, everything. The rest of the shift was quiet. I didn't see him again. Didn't change my route in the logbook at 7:03 a.m. I signed out, hung the red tag keys on their hook, and went home. Rowan, that's what it says on my county badge. I clipped it back on after signing out the key for the old cemetery gate from the clerk's desk. I had the permit, the grid map, and a work order to record every marker in a hillside plot outside Ashfield, Kentucky. The file called it inactive, unfenced, moderate risk, which sounded like legal code for you might get poison ivy but you'll live. My job was straightforward: document, tag, and map. I logged my start time on the clipboard, jotted the odometer reading for mileage reimbursement, and drove until the pavement gave up and turned into a dirt track ending at a pasture fence. The metal gate was chained shut. The key from the clerk fit the padlock. I swung the chain loose, opened the gate wide enough for my car, and parked inside so I wouldn't block the non-existent shoulder. Before I start a solo job, I run through my mental checklist like clockwork: compass, spare batteries, empty SD cards, pencils, chalk for lettering, 2 types of measuring tape, handheld GPS, a phone on airplane mode to save power, water, and my lunch bag. I set the GPS to start logging, marked the northwest corner as my grid origin, and tied a bright flag to the first fence post, so I could find it again if the grid got messed up. I always worked the same way, 10-meter squares, letters running north to south, numbers west to east. I tagged the first corner as A1, took the coordinates, then walked the boundary to get a rough outline on the GPS. The hill sloped steadily upward, with shrubs pushing between stones and an old pasture fence on 2 sides. About half an hour later, the corners were fixed in my head. I started the passes, recording coordinates, size and condition for each marker. I took photos, chalked faint lettering, pressed little numbered tags into the dirt, and made notes. I don't skip squares. I don't hop around. It's slow work unless you like order, and I like order. The first weird thing was small. In B3, the county list said there should be 2 stones, but I found 3. The extra was just a plain granite bevel with dates in the same era as the neighbors. I gave it a provisional code and flagged it for the county. That happens sometimes. Families replace markers without updating records. The second hiccup was just annoying. My camera flashed a storage warning barely 20 minutes in. I swapped the card, labeled the first one, and moved on, figuring I'd started with a half-full card by mistake. By lunch, my notes were neat. My GPS track matched my memory, and I was feeling good. Then I saw one of my tag numbers in the notes had a faint pencil underline I definitely hadn't made. It curved upward like a little flourish. I erased it without thinking too much about it and got back to work. C2 was the next real surprise. The list said 3 markers. I counted 5. 2 were newer, lined up oddly with the older burials, and their inscriptions had this strange detail. Both names trailed off. The last letters faint like someone stopped engraving halfway. I took my usual set of photos and coordinates, double-checking them. A little later, I noticed the GPS track showed a slow loop back towards C2, but I had no entries to match that movement. I went back. Everything was exactly how I'd left it. Same tags, same temporary codes. Then my camera storage warning came back way too soon. I scrolled through the card. Duplicate shots of the same stones, slightly different angles, and one photo with my own boots in frame, which I never include. I deleted extras but freed almost no space, so I swapped to a third card. When I went to stash the full card in the car, my tripod was lying across the back seat instead of under the storage bin where I keep it. The straps were unbuckled. I resecured it, made a note to check the locks later, and got back to work. In F2, I found a temporary plastic grave stake with an index card sealed under tape. The name on the card matched one of the newer stones in C2 same date, but listed a completely different row and plot. I photographed it and flagged it for the county. Families sometimes leave old markers when new stones go up. Except when I returned to C2 later, that exact stake was now sitting beside the same newer stone, looking perfectly undisturbed. Same handwriting, same tape, but there was an extra staple that hadn't been there earlier. By mid-afternoon, I decided to work toward the far boundary and then loop back. But when I aimed for the fence, I somehow ended up at C2 again. I tried a different direction, aiming for my starting flag gone, C2 again. My GPS showed a mess of points piled on points. I switched to physical landmarks, pacing along the pasture fence to keep orientation. The fence should have led me back to the gate, but it didn't. It was just continuous. No opening, no break, not even the painted survey post I'd recorded earlier. I counted posts, they matched my notes, but instead of a corner, I found myself at C2 yet again. I tried the big measuring tape, leaving chalk marks every 10 meters as breadcrumbs. After walking 100 meters by tape, the tape read 10. My phone's step count was scattered, and my chalk dots had curved straight back towards C2. That's when I checked the sealed envelope holding my second memory card, except it wasn't that card inside. Just a blank. My tripod straps were unbuckled again. This time, there was also a folded scrap of lined paper under the bin. 5 names in block letters. For match the newer C2 stones. The 5th was mine. I walked back to C2. The blank stone at the end of the newer row had a fresh sticker at the base, my handwriting, my code, C2 and U5. I only used those temporary stickers for anomalies, and I'd never put one on a blank marker. The ink matched my marker's shade, but the marker in my pocket was capped and clean. I decided right then, no more adding to the record. I wrote a plan, leave the tags, collect the temporary stickers, find the origin, and get out. But the grid origin was gone. The western fence edge didn't match the map. The GPS just circled me around C2 like a drain. So I picked a new method. The road connects to the county office, and the county office has the key. If I could reach the road, I was done. I packed up, set the car key on the seat with the scrap of names, and aimed for a utility pole in the distance. I didn't look at the stones. I didn't check the GPS. 600 counted paces later, I reached the fence. No gate. I pressed the wire down, stepped over, crossed the pasture, and hit the road. Distance felt normal again. When I reached the car, the clipboard had shifted slightly. The key was still there, but the scrap of names had been neatly folded and threaded onto the key ring. I pocketed both, left the gate chain hanging loose, and drove straight to the office. I put the clipboard and key on the counter, signed the return time, walked out, got in my car, and drove onto the highway. Jet handed me the cemetery maps. He ran the place and wanted me to check the old paper records against what was actually in the ground. He slid a penciled grid over a photocopied survey across the counter and told me to walk every row, write down each marker, and flag anything missing or unknown. Then he passed me the key, a roll of nylon flags, a clipboard, and a pencil that was basically a splinter with lead. I started at the gate and made myself a system so I wouldn't miss anything. 10 slow steps between stakes, take a photo, copy the dates, cross-check the plot number with the ledger. If there wasn't a number, I'd plant a flag at the base and write a quick index number on masking tape. I logged the gate as Station 0, counted every step, and figured I could build a crude distance scale by the end of the week. The maps went into a plastic sleeve, the bag stayed zipped, and I put my phone on airplane mode so the photo data wouldn't get weird. That first morning went smooth. Rows A through F matched the records. In row G, I found 2 empty spots where the ledger claimed there were burials. No big deal, sometimes families moved relatives to another cemetery years later. I marked those as vacated and kept going. At lunch, I checked my step counts. From the gate to Roji's midline, I'd written 312 steps. Coming back, the number was 297. Rewalking got me 304. I boxed all 3 numbers in my notes and scribbled soft ground beside them. Day 2, I headed for the old end, as Jet called it. His map stopped at roll, but the actual ground kept going past the property line on the paper. A low wire fence followed a shallow ditch, and beyond that was scrubby slope. The stones at the edge were smaller, closer together. Names were hard to read, but the dates were fine. 3 stones in a row, same death year, 1912. None of them in the ledger. I labeled them 01, 02, and 03 and flagged them. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped by the fence to count my flags. I started with 50, had planted 12. The bag should have had 38 left. It had 41, counted again 40. Dumped them out, stacked them in 10s 41. I zipped the bag tight and made a note to recheck before leaving. Heading back toward the main rows, I spotted a marker I hadn't logged, a tall, narrow stone just past the ditch on a neat little rectangle of ground. No name, no carving except a single date. 1912 right in the center. I balanced the clipboard on my leg and took a picture. The thumbnail came up black. Tried again, black. I photographed my boot, my hand, the fence. Those were fine. Turned back to the stone, black again. I walked around it looking for a hidden number. Nothing. I poked the pencil lead into the edge, normal stone. Tiny gray nick. I wrote 1912. No name online. Photo fails and underlined it twice. Next morning I brought Jet to the spot. We walked in silence until we got past the ditch. I pointed. The rectangle of ground was there, but the tall stone was gone. Jet said the cemetery stopped at the drawn line, tapped the map sleeve with his nail. I showed him the 3 flagged 1912 stones. He flipped through the ledger, stopped at row M, then looked at the fence and said those families weren't in his records. Maybe private markers outside the property, he suggested. I told him they were inside the fence. He said the survey said otherwise. I dropped it. Later, I remeasured the distance from the gate to the edge, row 335 steps, coming back 321. 10 paces equaled 9 meters every time I tested. I chalked a hash on the fence post at that mark and used it as my new reference. Distances beyond the midline stopped drifting, distances before it still wobbled. I rephotographed the 3 flagged stones, no problem. Tried the missing tall stone spot, black photo. At lunch, I grabbed extra notebook pages from the office. Jet asked if I was finding misalignments. I said the older section needed a fresh survey. He said he could bring the transit out later in the week. He asked who hired me. I gave him the name from the county email. He said he'd met that person once at a conference. Back outside, I noticed my pencil had started slipping 1912 into birth years on stones where it didn't belong. 3 times in 10 minutes. I fixed them, then checked old pages, same problem. The number showed up in margins on the map sleeve, even on my masking tape flag label. I wrapped a fresh label and tossed the old tape into the trash pouch in my bag. 10 minutes later, that same tape was sitting on the map. The pouch was empty, the ground was clear. I stuck the tape to the back of the notebook so it couldn't wander. Midway between the fence and the old row, I found a neat rectangle of turned soil, not long enough for a burial. Width of a plot, length of a small coffin cut in half, edges straight, dirt firm. I logged it and moved on. At the end of the day, I counted my flags. Should have been 32 left. Had 34. Checked my notes, apparently planted 18 that day, not 16. The 2 extras, 01 and 02 again. They were already logged yesterday. Day 4. I went to the edge first. The flagstones were still there. The short rectangle where the tall stone had been measured exactly 6 feet 3. I had never measured it before, so I wrote it down. At 10:20 a.m., my phone jumped to 10:20 p.m. and showed an old notification. Switching airplane mode fixed it. I took a photo of my watch next to the phone normal, tried photographing the rectangle black. At noon, I tried to print a new grid map in the office. The grid shifted a column right each time, cutting off row L. Even a test page with only my name came out with Vesper centered and 1912 faintly under it. Jet told me to use the old copies. He asked if I'd seen the tall stone again. I said no. I showed him the black thumbnails. He shrugged, cameras fail all the time. Around 2, I tripped over a string between 2 markers. Following it, I saw short lengths of twine connecting certain stones, always ones with 1912 inch, the birth or death year. One string ran past the fence into the scrub. I cut it, rolled it up, and put it in my bag. In the next row, the twine was back, perfectly coiled between two stones. My bag still had the ball I'd cut. I zipped them both inside and worked elsewhere. I ran a test, left my notebook on a stone in row D, took a photo, walked 50 steps, came back, it was on a different stone. Each time I repeated the test, it moved in a pattern. On the 7th try, it ended up beside the fence at the old end. I stopped testing. Later, the office clock said 317, my watch 402, and the computer 1111 frozen. I left a note saying I'd finished the edge row and returned the key. Back at the fence, I measured distances again, still wobbled. Across the ditch, the rectangle was there and the tall stone was back in it. Same date, 1912. I took a picture black. Measured its height, tape said 7 feet 3 inches, though it obviously wasn't that tall. Tried a pencil rubbing blank, except for a hard rectangle where the date should be. I decided to grab a witness, but when I came back from the gate 2 minutes later, the stone had shifted 3 feet forward. My measuring tape was now pinned under its base. The metal ends smeared gray. I set a ring of flags around it, sketched their positions, stepped back to watch. In minutes, the stone had inched until it sat perfectly inside the circle. Then I saw my bag sitting open beside it. I'd left it zipped by the fence. I moved it back and stayed near the chalk mark. The next time I stepped forward, the ground in front of the stone was cut open in a perfect plot-sized rectangle. No loose soil, no pile. I couldn't see the bottom even kneeling. My tape ran out at 30 feet. When I turned my phone on to log coordinates, the screen read 1912 where the time should be. The gallery had 20 identical black images labeled 3 minutes into the future. I shut it off. The paper rubbing in my sleeve had shifted its rectangle, no longer lined up with the stone's bond. I put it away. I made a plan, walked to the office, logged the closure, leave the key go. I left the flags where they were. On the way, distances stretched and shrank. My bag kept showing up where I hadn't left it. At the office, my key stuck in the lock. The clock was frozen at 12 o'clock. I signed the key in and wrote one line. Field work paused due to unrecorded excavation in old section perimeter marked will escalate to county. When I opened the door to leave, my paper badge was lying in the doorway. I hadn't unclipped it. I didn't touch it. I locked the door, walked to my car, and drove off. I was 29 when it happened. My cousin, Erin, called me one afternoon while I was halfway through making a sandwich. She's the kind of person who doesn't call unless it's important. Usually we just text, so I figured maybe someone was sick or there'd been a family emergency. Instead, she jumped straight into it. "You've got the car. Can you go check the old family cemetery? Someone in Waverly said graves have been messed with." That caught me off guard. The cemetery is out on this forgotten strip of land our families had for generations. I'd been there a handful of times as a kid, usually with my parents, for Memorial Day or to plant flowers, but we stopped going after my grandparents passed. Nobody lives nearby anymore. It's way out in the sticks, 40 minutes to the nearest gas station, and the road past that point is more loose gravel than actual pavement. I told her sure I'd go, partly because it felt like the right thing to do, and partly because I didn't think it would be a big deal. In my head, I pictured pulling up, walking through, snapping some photos, and texting her that everything was fine. Maybe I'd even stop for a coffee on the way home. The drive started out familiar, past the same old barns, the leaning telephone poles, but by the time I turned onto the gravel road, it felt like I was heading into somewhere that didn't entirely want visitors. You know that feeling when you realize it's been miles since you've passed another car? The cemetery looked exactly the way I remembered it, except for one thing. The gate is this old iron thing, rusted brown, leaning a little forward like it's been slowly losing the will to stand for decades. But when I pulled up, the padlock was gone. The chain was still looped there, dangling in place, but not secured. When I pushed it open, it let out a groan so loud it bounced off the surrounding hills. Inside, it was like time had paused, rows of stones leaning at angles. Some cracked, others broken completely. Here and there, the grass had given up entirely, leaving bare dirt patches. Weeds were muscling through the gravel paths. I headed straight for the back row, where my great-grandparents are buried. My great-grandmother's stone looked exactly the same, solid, upright, but my great-grandfather's grave, the dirt around it was wrong, uneven. Not like the soft hump of a new burial, more like someone had dug into it, then tried to smooth it out and pretend nothing happened. I crouched down and pressed my palm to the dirt. It gave under my hand more than it should have. I told myself, graves settle over time, and we'd had a lot of rain lately. But something about it made me want to glance over my shoulder. Then I spotted something that tightened my stomach, fresh boot prints in the mud, big ones. They circled another grave 3 times before leading toward the trees at the far edge, but they didn't connect to any path. A few feet in, they just stopped. No more prints, no bent branches, nothing, like the person had just stopped existing right there. I stood there for a good 30 seconds, debating whether I was curious enough to check. I turned back toward the path. That's when I noticed one of the headstones I'd passed earlier was now leaning sharply forward, like something had shoved it from behind. It wasn't a small stone, either. It was one of those thick granite markers that usually takes a team to move. I scanned the place, nothing, no movement, but the air had this weight to it now. Like the quiet wasn't just empty, was watching. I decided I'd done enough for Aaron. I started walking faster toward the gate. That's when I heard it. A slow scraping sound, stone dragging across stone. It was coming from the far corner, near the oldest graves. I almost kept going, I really should have. But my head turned anyway. That's when I saw it. A tall monument, taller than me, and easily the weight of a car was sliding backward. No one behind it, no equipment. Just this steady grinding movement until a dark gap opened beneath it. I froze. Then came the sound from inside, a dull thump. Then another, heavy, rhythmic, like something hitting wood from underneath. That was enough for me. I turned and started toward the gate at a near run. I was maybe 10 feet away when a sudden, freezing gust slammed into me, hard enough to make me stumble. The gate clanged shut. The latch was still open, but when I shoved it, nothing happened. It was like pushing against a wall. My chest went tight. I dropped my bag and scrambled up the bars. The iron spikes at the top dug into my hands, scraping skin, but I didn't stop until I'd swung myself over and hit the gravel outside. I didn't brush myself off. I just got in the car, slammed the door, locked it, and started the engine. My hands were shaking against the wheel. I made the mistake of looking back from the road. The gate stood wide open again. The monument was upright, no gap. The footprints were gone. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I sat there on the shoulder, breathing hard, until I could call Erin. I told her everything, exactly once. We haven't spoken about it since. I was 41 when it happened, and I'd been in Oak Ridge, Kentucky for a little over 6 months. I'd moved there for what I thought would be a slower, easier pace. My little rental house was nothing fancy, peeling paint, creaky floors, but it had a wraparound porch and sat far enough from town that the nights were pitch dark and dead quiet. About a mile away, hidden behind a thick wall of oaks and sycamores, there was a cemetery the locals called Miller's Rest. The name didn't make sense. None of the stones had Miller on them, and no one could tell me where it came from. The place dated back to the mid-1800s, but unless you already knew exactly where to turn, you'd never find it. The entrance was just a narrow dirt track that curved off the road and disappeared into the trees. I'd driven past that turn plenty of times. Always noticed the little gap in the tree line, but never thought much of it. People in town like to tell the usual small-town cemetery stories. Kids daring each other to sneak in at night. Hunters swearing they'd seen lanterns swinging between the graves. I figured it was just a local pastime to keep the place interesting. That's why, when my neighbor Paul knocked on my door one evening, the cemetery wasn't the first thing I expected him to bring up. He told me the last storm had taken down a lot of branches out there. Said the volunteer maintenance crew was backed up for weeks, and if someone didn't clear them soon, they could damage some of the older stones. Then, he just looked at me and asked if I wanted to help. Paul's not the kind of guy who asks for help lightly, so I grabbed my gloves and a handsaw. We headed out just before dusk. Paul drove his little utility cart, one of those squat, rattly things that sounds like it's about to give up on every hill, and I walked behind, swinging the saw over my shoulder. The track into the woods was rough, full of deep ruts where old tires had sunk into mud long ago. The farther we went, the cooler the air got, and it felt like the sound from the road behind us had been cut off completely. When we finally reached the gate, I remember thinking it looked exactly the way a gate to an old cemetery should look. Iron bars crusted with rust, one hinge so warped that the gate never fully closed. It hung there, leaning in just enough to look like it was waiting for someone to push it wider. Inside, the place was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 30 graves in total. Most of the headstones leaned like tired teeth, and a few were so weathered that the names were just shadows of letters. The grass was wild and high, almost up to my waist in spots, and weeds curled over the shorter markers like they'd been trying to bury them too. We'd been at it for maybe an hour, dragging branches to the gate, when I saw them 3 fresh mounds of dirt at the far back corner under a big walnut tree. They were neat, almost too neat, with clean edges like they'd been shaped with care. There were no markers, no flowers, no sign anyone had been there to pay respects. The soil was still loose and dark, untouched by rain. "Who's buried over there?" I called to Paul. He didn't even look up from where he was working. "Nobody's been buried here in decades," he said, his voice completely flat. Then he went right back to dragging another branch, like I hadn't said anything at all. We worked until the light drained out of the sky. The shadows seemed to gather faster in that place than they did anywhere else. Paul decided we'd done enough for one evening. We stacked our tools just inside the gate and started down the track toward the road. Halfway there I patted my jacket and realized I'd left my gloves back at the gate. Paul was already too far ahead in the cart, so I told myself it'd be a quick walk back. The return trip felt different. The air was still heavier somehow. When I reached the cemetery, the gate was sitting half open the way we'd left it. My gloves were draped over the corner of a tilted headstone, just where I'd set them. I was reaching for them when I heard a low, heavy thump from somewhere deeper in the cemetery. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling. It had weight to it, like something solid hitting the ground on purpose. It came from the far corner, the one with the mounds. I turned my head. The closest mound had shifted not much, but enough that I could see the top layer of dirt had slumped down in a small ridge. There was no wind, no movement in the trees. I took a step back toward the gate. Then it came again, a sharper, louder thump. Under it, just barely, there was a muffled sound of something moving beneath the soil. That was enough. I didn't care about the gloves anymore. I stepped out through the gate without looking away from that corner and walked quickly down the track. My pace stayed steady until the trees began to thin. Then I ran. The next morning, I convinced Paul to go back with me. He didn't like the idea, but I wasn't going alone. When we got there, the far corner looked completely different. The mounds were gone, not dug up, not disturbed, just gone. The ground was flat and level, covered in a fresh scatter of leaves that hadn't been there yesterday. We didn't talk about it, not on the way back, not after. Paul's never asked me to help there again, and I haven't set foot on that track since. Behind me, my friend Mason lugged the camera case and a cardboard box of bright orange survey flags. He'd applied for a preservation grant, and my part in the whole thing was simple. Jot down each headstone, make a note of damage, and keep him walking in a straight line so his shots matched the map we'd been given. We started at the southeast corner. Mason popped the camera from its foam cradle, gave the lens a quick inspection, and gave me a nod. I marked the first row on the map and penciled a little dot on the nearest stone proof we'd logged it. His routine was 3 shots per headstone, side, face, inscription. It was slow, predictable work. Honestly, kind of boring, which I liked. Boring meant nothing unexpected. Row 3, I wrote down a name, a year, and a chipped corner. Mason checked his histogram, seemed happy, and we kept going. According to the plan, we'd hit the top of the hill by noon, loop around the north side, and come back to the gate in one clean oval. The diagram was straightforward, rows like ribs, dirt laying around the inside fence. I kept my map visible at all times, checking off each segment with thick pencil strokes so we didn't double up. Everything went fine until it didn't. Halfway up the slope, I logged a headstone with a willow carving and a crack across its face. I drew a small circle beside its number on the grid. 10 minutes later, we came across the exact same headstone. Same willow, same crack, even the same little insect chew along the paper rubbing Mason had just taken. I flipped back. My own circle was staring at me. Mason compared the shots identical, down to a scratch in the lichen. We'd somehow looped, even though the map said otherwise. I decided to cut across straight to the western boundary fence line was a sure thing, right? We picked a row, walked 20 paces, then another 20. Still no fence. Just more stones and more ground than there should have been. Not dramatic, but wrong in the kind of way that makes your stomach fold. Mason capped the lens, squinted like he could see a fix in the distance, then told me to keep our route tight until we hit something unmistakable. So we aimed for the marble obelisk, the only one marked on the map. Couldn't mess that up. Past a couple short markers, a broken slab, a flat ledger. The obelisk was right where it was supposed to be. Mason got his shots, including one with the scale ruler. I logged the tilt, circled it on my sheet. Coming down from it, we walked right by a headstone carved with a lamb that I'd already marked in a completely different row. 2 segments away, we didn't cross that gap. There wasn't time to. Mason didn't comment, just took the picture like it was any other marker. First gear failure came with the rangefinder. It read 8 meters to the fence. Reasonable. We walked 10 by my stride count, and the fence was still not any closer. Another reading, 9 meters, then 11, then back to 8. I tapped the housing, reset it. 3 meters now. Fence still nowhere near where it should be. I shoved it in my bag and stuck to the paper map, because at least paper doesn't change its mind. We pushed on shoot, log, flag, the ones that needed repair. I built a rhythm. The loop kept spitting us back to markers we'd already seen. So I taped the map to my clipboard, drew arrows, checked off every row we planned to cross. That way we had a physical, no-nonsense reference. Midway up, Mason suggested a break. We leaned our gear against a tall slate headstone. I pulled 2 granola bars from my pocket, stuffed my wrapper back in after eating, because littering in a cemetery feels wrong. Mason wiped his hands and reached for the camera. Camera was where he'd left it. Tripod wasn't naff. It was 3 rows away, fully set up, legs extended, center column raised. Mason never raised the center column. He didn't say a word, just walked briskly. Collapsed it and came back. I mentally logged equipment reposition, no explanation. Next the clock, his camera time stamps were jumping backward, then forward again 14 minutes off, then suddenly in sync with nothing we had on us, he reset it twice. The next shot landed in a time zone of its own. He said we'd deal with it later, and kept shooting when we hit the plateau of the map. Promised a central lane near a water spigot. I spotted it, pointed. Mason raised the camera to get a shot. In the frame behind the spigot, the cemetery gate sat wide open, even though the Real gate was 200 yards behind and to the right. I looked with my own eyes, nothing but grass and stones. He took a second shot. In that one, the gate was closed. He didn't bother guessing out loud. The next glitch was mine. I marked a repair candidate with chalk at the base. 3 stones later, Mason asked me to confirm the grid number. The chalk dot was gone. A dot same size, same chalk was now on the stone to the left. I replaced it. 2 rows later, both dots had vanished, and a new one appeared on a headstone I'd never touched. I gave up and wrote a note. Marks move relog without field dots. At the hill's crest, Mason shot a panorama. The obelisk showed up twice, once where it should be, once 100 yards off. Second attempt, only 1 obelisk. No celebration. We decided to finish the north loop and leave. Easier said than done. The descent stretched forever. The lane never met us where it should. New markers appeared, names I hadn't seen, dates in strange pairs. Mason finally picked a tree beyond the fence and lined up the tripod like a scope. We walked straight for it. The tree never quite landed in the spot it should. The obelisk popped up again to our right. We didn't talk about it. I tried marking our trail 3 bright tape flags in a row. 10 rows later, they were still there. 5 more rows, and a 4th flag appeared tied exactly the way I tie them, but 2 stones off our line. I didn't retrieve it. Inside a small family plot, a missing chain link returned between glances, only to disappear from another spot. I stopped logging the chain entirely. Our phones disagreed on the time. The camera time disagreed with both. Mason finally said, straight, no more stops. Eventually the lane reappeared, curving as it should toward the perimeter, except it spat us back into the middle again. We cut across. The lane popped up 3 rows to our left. Mason sighted the gate through the long lens, lined it up with a double headstone shaped like an open book. Through the camera, perfect alignment. With my eyes, just the book. He walked toward it without lowering the camera. I steered him around stones. When we reached it, the gate had vanished. 2 rows ahead in the viewfinder, gone to the naked eye. Worse, the tripod had relocated again. 3 stones back, angled toward where we'd been walking. The family plot with the iron fence was supposed to have 1 entry. We walked through it, crossed the plot, and exited through the same opening without turning back. The map said square, the place said otherwise. Mason set up for 1 last sweep. In the live view, a headstone-shaped silhouette appeared in the lane where there was nothing in reality. Each time he panned, the shape shifted closer, not walking, just existing in new spots, always facing us like a stone does. He cut the live view, collapsed the tripod, and said we were done. No more photos. No more notes. We walked hard, aiming for where the gate should be. The stones kept reshuffling. The obelisk refused to stay behind us. The lane folded back in. Finally, 60 seconds of not deviating. Straight ahead, the gate appeared exactly as we'd seen it coming in. Mason checked the camera. The view matched reality for once. I didn't wait. I shoved the tripod at him, grabbed the gate with both hands, forced it open, and pulled him through by the camera strap. As soon as we were on the gravel outside, I slammed it shut, dropped the latch, and headed for the car without looking back. The cemetery sat way out at the end of this narrow gravel road in rural Kentucky, tucked behind a white clapboard church that looked like it had been giving up on itself for decades. The paint peeled in big curls, the kind you could probably pull off and hold strips if you wanted, and the front steps sagged just enough to make you wonder if they'd hold. The place hadn't hosted a real congregation since before I was born. Locals said it closed in the early 70s, and standing there, you could believe it. It wasn't falling down, not exactly, but it had that feeling of a building no one loved anymore. A small historical preservation group in the county had contacted me about documenting the older gravestones before weather and time erased them completely. Some of them were so worn that even now you had to squint to read them. My instructions were straightforward. Take clear photos, write down the inscriptions, send the files over. A couple of afternoons' work at most. The drive out there was quiet, just empty two-lane roads cutting through fields. When I pulled in that afternoon, the place had that strange kind of emptiness where nothing's technically broken, but it still feels like it's been hollowed out. Gravel popped under my tires until it turned to packed dirt by the church. I parked beside it, killed the engine, and sat for a second longer than I needed to. No real reason. Just that weird little pause you take when you feel like you're the only person around for miles. The cemetery gate hung slightly off its hinge, but it opened without a fight. I stepped in, camera bag slung over one shoulder, and started with the first row of graves. The newer ones, well, newer being relative, were simple enough. Mid-20th century markers, still legible. Some with sun-faded plastic flowers that looked like they'd been out there a year or more. A few had little trinkets at the base coins. Figurines, the kinds of things people leave when they don't visit often, but still want to leave something behind. I worked my way down the hill, my pattern pretty much automatic. Kneel, read, photograph, jot the notes, move on. With each row the stones leaned more, their edges rounded from decades of weather. Some were so faint I had to run my fingers over the carvings to feel the letters. That's when I saw it. Halfway down the slope, near the tree line, was a headstone from 1892. It tilted slightly, but was still holding upright. Right next to it, though, was something that didn't belong, a patch of soil that looked freshly dug. It was darker than the surrounding ground, looser, and formed a mound about 6 feet long. There were no flowers, no marker, nothing in my reference notes about a recent burial. And there wasn't a single sign of the tools you'd expect. No shovel, no wheelbarrow, no tracks leading to it. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it, before pulling out my camera and snapping a photo. Then I made a quick mental note to ask the preservation group about it later. 15 minutes passed. I'd moved a dozen stones over when I glanced back toward the spot. The mound was gone. Not partially flattened or spread out by rain, just gone. The ground was perfectly level, grass and all, like it had been that way for years. I blinked a few times, squinting, trying to match the view in front of me with what I was sure I'd just seen. Eventually I told myself it was probably just the angle or the way the light hit the slope earlier. I've talked myself out of stranger things. Still, there was this low, creeping tension sitting at the back of my neck as I kept working. By the time I reached the last row near the woods, the place had gone completely still. No cicadas, no breeze, nothing. The kind of silence that feels too full. I crouched to get a low angle of one particularly worn stone, pressed the shutter, and my camera screen glitched. Bands of static cut across the preview, twisting the image into something unrecognizable. I frowned, tried again. Same result. I wiped the lens, checked the battery, switched to my phone camera. Every single shot came out warped. Not blurry, warped, like the subject itself had been stretched and bent before I took the photo. I was about to move on when I noticed someone. Up by the church, at the top of the hill, a figure stood perfectly still. Too far to make out details, but I knew they were facing me, watching. My first thought was that maybe a caretaker had shown up. But when I stepped toward them, they slipped out of sight in a way that was too quick, too deliberate. I climbed the hill faster than I'd intended, eyes locked on the path so I wouldn't trip. My pulse stayed steady, but my chest felt tight in a way that made me very aware of my breathing. When I rounded the side of the church, there was no one there. Just peeling paint, weeds pushing through the cracks in the steps, and that silence pressing in again. Then I heard it, a dull, heavy thump from behind me, down in the cemetery. I turned. The mound was back. This time it was taller, like more dirt had been piled onto it in the last half hour. Loose soil spilled unevenly into the grass, and sticking out from the very top was something pale and curved. I walked toward it before I could talk myself out of it. It was bone, the smooth, yellowed edge of a jawbone pushing up through the soil. My hands twitched toward my camera, but the thought of taking a picture of it made me feel cold all over. I shoved my camera into my bag without bothering to zip it and started back toward the car. I'd made it halfway across the lot when a second thump came. The car door slammed, the engine turned over, and I reversed hard enough to send gravel flying behind me. I didn't slow down until I'd put 20 miles between me and that church. I was 27 when it happened. There's this old cemetery out past Harrods Grove, Kentucky, tucked at the bend of a narrow road where the asphalt gives up trying to be smooth. If you weren't looking for it, you'd probably drive right past. The only sign it exists is a crooked wooden board, the paint long gone, and the wood splintered like it had been chewed at for years. I'd been there once before, a long time ago, but never alone. This time, the local history group I sometimes help out asked me to document a few of the older headstones, names, dates, plot numbers. They gave me a printed map and a list, and that was it. I parked just outside the gate, my car angled toward the road. That's something my dad always did when he had to stop somewhere out in the sticks. Made sure he could leave fast if he needed to. Not that I expected trouble. It's just one of those habits you keep without thinking. I grabbed my clipboard, pen tied to it with a piece of frayed string that looked like it might give out at any second, and headed for the gate. The iron gate was heavier than I expected. I leaned into it with my shoulder, and it gave a long metallic groan as it swung open. Inside, the grass was uneven, patches thick enough to tangle your ankles and others worn down to bare dirt. The stones were tilted, like they'd been trying to lie down for years but hadn't quite made it. A dirt path cut through the center, but it looked more like a suggestion than something anyone actually used. I started along it, keeping my eyes on the stones, mentally checking off landmarks against the map. The first 20 minutes were easy. I'd walk up to a stone, brush away moss or dirt with the edge of my sleeve, lean close to read the worn lettering, then mark it off my list. Sometimes the names matched perfectly. Sometimes the dates were too faded to trust. So I took a photo. The work was quiet, the kind of quiet that just becomes background noise after a while. And then I noticed them. A row of headstones I didn't remember seeing on the map. These were different edges, still sharp, lettering crisp and dark, like they'd been cut in the last year. I checked the list. Not a single one matched. I figured maybe they'd been added after the list was made. So I started writing them down anyway. I glanced up mid-word to recheck a date, and did a double take. The row looked longer, not dramatically, just enough that the last stone seemed farther away than it had been a few seconds earlier. I told myself the uneven ground was messing with my depth perception, but I tested it, took 3 careful steps forward, and the row seemed to stretch again almost lazily, like it was trying not to be noticed. That's when I felt it, the air heavier on my shoulders, like I'd been standing under a low ceiling. I made myself turn back toward the main path. It wasn't there. Where the path should have been was another row of stones. These ones were all different shapes and sizes, placed at odd angles. They looked like they'd been collected from different cemeteries and dropped here. I turned in a slow circle, every direction, graves, more than I'd seen when I came in. The grass was higher now, up to my knees in places. My brain tried to keep up. Maybe I drifted into another section, maybe the map was wrong. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, somewhere behind one of the newer stones. It wasn't leaves. It wasn't wind. It was thicker, heavier, like soil shifting. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Then 3 taps. Slow, evenly spaced. From the far side of the stone right in front of me, the pen in my hand suddenly felt ridiculous. I stepped back, slow, my eyes locked on that headstone. I turned to head for the fence, only to realize it wasn't behind me anymore. Instead, more graves. Closer now. Their inscriptions caught my eye as I passed every single date recent within the last month. Then I saw it. A stone with my name, my full name, below it today's date. My chest locked up. The ground under me felt soft, like it had been dug recently. My shoe sank just enough that I felt the give of loose dirt. I yanked it free. Somewhere in the process, I dropped the clipboard. I started moving, not caring where. I weaved between the stones, brushing against cold granite. My breathing was loud, ragged, and every step came with the creeping certainty that something else was moving just out of sight, keeping pace. Then, without warning, the fence was there. Just a few feet away. I didn't question it. I shoved through the gate, nearly tripping on the uneven ground outside, and sprinted for my car. My hands shook so badly, I missed the ignition on the first try. I didn't look back until I was miles away.